think it's going. I think it's going. So yeah, you learnt about you started storytelling by going on motorbike tours across the South African across South Africa, was it? And
well, no, much further than that. I went up to Kenya 3 times on a bike. I've been to northern Zaire on a motorbike. Lots of trips to Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, and a lot of traveling around in South Africa. And the chaps at university used to really enjoy those stories. And then one of them became curator of the Rorkestrip Museum, where David Rattray worked. He was known as the doyen of the Anglo-Zulu War storytelling. And indeed, at the time of his death in 2007, was regarded by the British media as perhaps the greatest storyteller of his age in the world. He was only 48 when he died. And he was looking for someone to help him telling stories on the battlefields. And the curator gave it some thought and remembered me. And he didn't know where I was or what I was doing, but he said, look, this chap told a pretty good story about his motorbike trips. And I think that if you could teach him the history, he could tell these stories. So he organized a meeting between David Rattray and myself in the year 2000. And the rest really has become history. I worked with David closely for 7 years until his death in January of 2007. And then I continued running the lodge with my partner, Karen, and the battlefield talks and stories for another 5 years to the end of 2011. And then we went on our own 10 years ago, where I wanted to paddle my own boat and also expand the repertoire of stories I was telling. I didn't only want to be telling stories about the Anglo-Zulu War. And well, the first 8 years pre-COVID went surprisingly well. It was a charmed existence, doing talks on these expedition ships, cruise ships, England, various parts of the world, Royal Geographical Society in Hong Kong and Singapore. And then, of course, all the battlefield tours and the talks here locally. COVID has knocked that into a tin hat, obviously, but it really has been a fascinating journey, the idea of making a living out of little more than a told story. And I feel very privileged and honored to be doing that and still doing it 21 years on.
Yes, I could imagine. And for anybody, for those of you watching, Rob has a YouTube channel where he has very generously posted some excellent videos where he showcases his storytelling ability and tells some excellent stories about the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War, I should say, the Anglo-Zulu War, and indeed polar exploration, which I have to say, I am deeply unfocused in my interest in history. I will dash around all sorts of places to whatever fires my imagination, and polar exploration is absolutely one of those things, as well as the Anglo-Zulu War. So I think that you are probably one of the luckiest people I've ever talked to to be able to do what you do.
Well, look, Josh, I consider myself extremely fortunate doing what I'm doing, but it's a very interesting start point, that too, for a conversation, because I discuss it very often with many people. I was lucky enough to travel across Africa from Cape Town to Cairo in 1993 with what was called the Africa Odyssey expedition, headed up by Kingsley Holgate. I then traveled around the world with a backpack unbroken for 3 years and did various things on that trip. Two of the top priorities were to walk in the high Himalayas in Nepal and Tibet, and to drive the Alaskan-Canadian highway from Dawson Creek, British Columbia, to Fairbanks, Alaska. And as things have unfolded in my life, and I then met David in my mid-30s in 2000, and his invitation to come and join him telling stories on the Zulu War battlefields, I thought, I've got nothing really to lose. If it doesn't work out, I can move on and return to the things I've been doing customarily and have been trained to do, rather than this 180-degree swing in my career path. And I always say to folks who are prepared to listen, you need in life to be prepared to seize the opportunities that come your way. You know, it's all very well to say, I'm very fortunate and privileged to be doing what I am doing. And there's no doubting that. But I also, along the way, have taken risks and been prepared to seize the opportunities that came my way. So it's not only about leading a charmed life, it's actually about making decisions and taking opportunities that lead you on a path you aspire to in terms of your life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, And Singwao at Descent-1, isn't it? He took the chance to win a battle and he won it.
Well, this is the thing. And you know, quite interestingly, in battle, it's often the side who make the least mistakes who end up victorious. And oftentimes they hang on a knife edge, these battles, as Isandlwana did for some considerable moments before the Zulus were rallied by a grand old commander who in fact turned that battle on its head.
And I have to say that when I was watching your videos, and I was specifically looking for content on Isandlwana when I was looking around, when I found you actually. I loved what you said about not telling the story of the battle without telling the story of the grand old man who turned the tide of the battle. Because when I read about that, and I think it was in The Washing of the Spears, or maybe it was Ian Knight's Zulu Rising, one of the two, I thought roughly the same, that this is the pivotal moment of this battle.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, for many Zulus, his rallying cry is still a rallying cry for them today. And he's become a great folk hero for the Zulu people. And we will never, ever tell the story of Isandlwana without relating who the Zulus believe is the true great hero of the battle. Because with our whiteskins and typically Anglophilic view, it's all too easy to become preoccupied with what was going on the British side of the camp in the battle, and to forget that the Zulus were about to pull off the greatest victory in their history. And central to the theme of that battle was a grand old man who shouted as the Umqija warriors were about to withdraw, "Yeninelapia ninga baleg, ninga baleg, silo uhlahlana bulala umlilo, ungashonga njalo." You mean don't run, don't run. The king, the small branch that extinguishes the flames. That's one of King Qetshwa's praise names. He gave us no such order. And with that, he was killed by a British bullet that took away most of his skull. Rallying cry had been made and heard by his regiment and the regiments adjacent to it. And with that, with his example, they got up like a great black wave and began to fall on that thin red British firing line. Yes, it's a seminal and pivotal point in the battle.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would hope if they were ever to remake or make another movie about Isandlwana, they would include this particular moment and perhaps give more time to the Zulu side, in fact. For the record, for those listening, what was that old chief's name?
Mkhosana Kamvundlana of the Biela clan. So Mkhosana was his name, Kamvundlana was his surname, of the Biela clan, who are still a prominent clan in Zululand today and live near the town of Melmoth in Zululand.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories of Isandlwana, that, and I do always actually prefer, if I tell anybody about the Battle of Isandlwana, to try and tell it from as much from the Zulu side as possible. You need a balance, but to be honest, Isandlwana, as I've always said to people, is a battle that people think that the British lost rather than the Zulus won.
Absolutely. We always tell it from that point of view. We feel more importantly that it's a battle the Zulus won rather than the battle that the British lost. And it's amazing how the British books and authors and historians have tried to explain away the defeat by trying to include things like the British never had enough screwdrivers to open ammunition boxes, or the tents were not struck, and the wagons were not lagered. And we were overwhelmed by the numbers of Zulus. Well, all those things come into it. But really and truly, the British on the day were outgeneraled, outflanked, outmaneuvered, and grossly outnumbered. And they underestimated the Zulus to their folly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a classical scenario of how to do everything wrong for the British side and how to do pretty much everything right for the Zulu side.
Yes.
You have concentration of force on the Zulu side. You have disparity of force on the British side. You have open flanks on the British side, or poorly guarded flanks on the British side, and enveloping forces on the Zulu side. It's just the whole list from one side to the other is really interesting, and possibly one of the reasons why Isandlwana continues to hold, apart from the drama of the day, in people's interest. And of course, there's the as a friend of mine once said, the charge of the Dabulamanzi Brigade at Rorke's Drift.
Well, that's a complete mirror of Isandlwana, because the lack of tactic, discipline, and coordination at Rorke's Drift amongst the Zulus is the complete mirror of their success in the morning at Isandlwana. And I always like to remind people that Queen Victoria and the central British government had not sanctioned the invasion of Zululand, which led to the huge defeat at Isandlwana. And the Zulu king had clearly told his warriors not to cross the rivers Buffalo and Tugela into Natal. And they did so against his order and got a thrashing at Rorke's Drift. And many of my guests love the takeaway line of the results or the reactions of doing things that you've been told expressly not to do.
Cetewayo so wanted to try and retain the moral high ground, and so don't invade Natal. But of course, the Bulamanzi and his boys said, let's go down to Kwajim's, because we missed most of the fighting, didn't we? Let's see if we can get some loot.
Yeah, they wanted loot, and they wanted to bathe the Assegas in blood to be afforded the privilege of marriage and glory when they got home. And I think also, if you look at it objectively, if they were going to knock out the central column, which they had succeeded in knocking out half of it at Isandlwana, it also made sense to knock out their forward supply base, which Rorke's Drift constituted. So there are many valid reasons for the Zulu attacking Rorke's Drift, which many people who want to condemn or vilify the Zulus fail to acknowledge.
It's true. It is actually, absolutely. It is absolutely a solid military consideration to try and take out the supply base, because the supplies, for a start, are useful to have and to deny to the enemy, who are obviously still in Zululand. And actually, Isandlwana is only one of a number of reverses the British encounter in the early part of the invasion, which a lot of people miss. You have them being bottled up at Ishao, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Ishawi, well done.
Thank you very much. And which is the other one where a small company, is it of the 90th, gets wiped out?
That was at Ntombe Drift on the 12th of March. The men under Captain Moriarty were wiped out on the banks of the Ntombe stream near Lüneburg. It's an incredible saga, what happened there. Then on the 28th of March, the British were given a proper drubbing at the Battle of Vlobane, which is north of Vryheid. On the 2nd of April, the Zulus received a drubbing at Gingendorf before the siege of Ishowi was relieved. And then, of course, the big one that many people overlook is the fact that the last Napoleon, the Prince Imperial of France, was killed in an ambush situation on the 1st of June, 1879, by Zulus in Zululand. And many forget that the Napoleonic dynasty ended in a donga here in Zululand.
Yeah, it's one of those brilliant parts of history, isn't it? That not only does the last Napoleon die in a donga in Zululand, but also in a British uniform.
Well, absolutely. It's interesting. As a Frenchman, he couldn't wear an officer's commission, but he certainly conducted himself as if he was an officer, and everyone tended to defer to him with that royal blood. I mean, his family had been exiled from France after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and then his father died in 1873, leaving Louis Jean-Joseph Napoleon with his mother, the Empress Eugenie, being given succor really by Queen Victoria in England. And he graduated well at Woolwich as an artillery officer, and then came out to South Africa and was dying to be injured in action. But the injuries that he sustained that day were far more than he'd hoped for and resulted in his death.
Yes, it's one of the. There were a lot of rough ways to go during the Anglo-Zulu War for the British and apparently the French, and obviously their Natal and Boer and African allies, because the Zulus didn't go quietly.
Oh, they certainly didn't. I mean, this war was expected to be over in 3 weeks. The British had invaded without the sanction of Britain and wanted to get it over with before Britain even found out. They also wanted to avoid the issue of being in Zululand with no grazing for the cattle and the horses in a winter after 3 years of drought that preceded the war. And Chelmsford once wrote a letter to his family saying that he prayed and believed that after the Zulus felt the effect of the Martini-Henry rifle for the first time, it would be difficult to get them to engage a second time. Now, that to me is overriding confidence and arrogance, really, that cost the British dearly in this campaign.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I've read somewhere that the Zulus didn't even. I mean, nobody wants to be shot, obviously, and the Martini-Henry packed a powerful punch, but they weren't necessarily afraid of the weaponry. They didn't like closing with the bayonets so much. They were more afraid, apparently. I read somewhere that someone had the opinion that they were a little bit more worried about the long British bayonets than the musketry.
Well, look, I think that most human beings are terrified of cold steel, as we call it.
Yeah.
And the bayonet used by the British at that time was what is called a lung socket bayonet, and it attached over the end of the barrel as bayonets do. But the blade was actually triangular, and it was made triangular largely for European warfare because a triangular wound is impossible to stitch, which is a horrible thought that people would design something with that result in mind. And of course, the Martini-Henry, because of the black powder and the slow velocity of the bullet, had to be long to stabilize the bullet. And with the 22-inch lung socket bayonet attached, gave the average British soldier, who were of mean height around 5'4", more than 6 feet of reach. And they were especially trained in all these drills about how to lunge with their bayonets and their rifles. And I think that the Zulus were afraid of them because the bayonet was sharp enough, it went straight through a spear. And indeed, the British soldiers, it's a very, very frightening weapon to have used against you at close quarters, the Martini-Henry bayonet as it was then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very good point as well about the who invents a weapon, the sort of the production and thought that goes into creating a weapon that is difficult, the wound from which is difficult to heal is a very interesting facet on that. But moving away from sort of the technical aspects of how you kill someone, I mean, the classic idea is of the Zulu with his shield and spear fighting a bit like a Roman, and the British with his rifle and bayonet fighting a little bit as if he has a spear. Moving away from that, this sort of popular dynamic, I do, like you were saying before, find a lot of the characters of the Anglo-Zulu War, and indeed history generally. I tend to stray towards the Anglo-Zulu War because that's the one I know most about. But people like King Cetshwayo and obviously his family, and obviously the most, would you say King Cetshwayo is more important than Shaka, or is Shaka more important than King Cetshwayo?
Sadly, I think in the greater scheme of things that Shaka is deemed to be more important and certainly better known than Cetshwayo. I mean, Shaka revolutionized the Zulu army. He's regarded by many as being Africa's Black Napoleon. And unfortunately, the legends regarding his tyranny and his leadership have grown in the telling. But there's no doubting that Shaka was probably the most influential Zulu. He was not king. Everyone refers to him as King Shaka. He was illegitimate. So he really, in strictly correct terms, needs to be referred to as a paramount chief. And he came to the chieftaincy of the Ilangeni clan, who became later known as the Zulu clan, in 1816, but was stabbed brutally to death by his two half-brothers, Mhlangan and Dengan, in 1828. His mother died the previous year in 1827, and Shaka went berserk. And there was widespread killing and massacres all over Zululand, that his people could feel the pain and the hurt that he was feeling. And probably as a result of that maniacal genocidal madness, he was murdered the following year and fell, the legend has it, with those words, "You think you will rule this land, but there are white people coming in from the sea who will take this land from you," which I think is largely what governed his replacement, King Dengan, and murderers short reign from 1828 to 1840. And there's no doubting, Josh, that if you were to walk down sidewalks in Britain and ask people if they've heard of Shaka, have they heard of Quechua, you would have far more who've heard of Shaka than have heard of Quechua. And I think that Quechua was politically very astute and unfortunately led the Zulu people at a time where the resurrection of the Zulu army was seen to stand as a major military threat to the British plan of confederation here after the discovery of diamonds and gold.
I think that King Quechua was a very fascinating guy. And I love the idea that he came out of a civil war where he had to wrestle for the throne, and that the Zulu battle cry, one of them, in the battles against the British was Usutu, which was his faction, wasn't it?
Absolutely, dead right.
Yeah, I love that little nugget there that sort of speaks to that they are the king's men, sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, you know, that whole thing about the Prince's War or the War of the Brothers, because Mpande, Quechua's father, made a very, very interesting decision to give Quechua and a younger brother called Mboyazi a war shield each, which basically implies that you need to go and sort out the differences in the civil war between you. And with that, both began to assemble about themselves their respective factions. And Quechuas were known as the Usutu, as you've correctly pointed out, and Mbuyazis were known as the Mantlakazi. And they came to blows on the banks of the Tugela River on the 2nd of December of 1856. And the battle that followed saw 30,000 lives lost, 25,000 on the side of the Mantlakazi and 5,000 on the side of the Usutu. And most people have never even heard of that battle, a place that was forever afterwards known as Matambo, the place of bones, on account of the number of skeletons left littered on that floodplain after the battle. It's a tragic, tragic scene.
Yes, I mean, the numbers there are staggering, actually. That must be one of the largest battles in African history, surely.
Well, look, some would say probably one of the largest battles and loss of life on African soil since the Crusades. The only one that comes close to matching it is when the dervishes under the Mahdi burst into Khartoum on the 25th of January of 1885, when they besieged Gordon and all of the citizens in Khartoum. And although they were starving to death and very weak, when the dervishes broke in, they killed literally by slitting the throats of 25,000 individuals in Khartoum.
Yeah, the Mahdi's war was a particularly bad one for civilian casualties. Especially, I mean, whenever you get a popular rising and they bottle up a city, it actually is always terrible for the civilian population. But yeah, I am very uneducated on the Zulu Civil War that led to this massive clash. Like you say, I would be amongst those who don't know a lot about it, except that I know a great battle happened. And I would think that a lot of people probably know about Shaka more because of this series with Henry. Is it Henry Sele?
Henry Sele, dead right, yes.
And he did a great job, I think, as a Shaka, but playing the part, you know, that was an amazing performance.
It was an amazing performance. Yeah.
I think that's probably why people know Shaka, because that series was really popular when it came out, and so he's sort of like a cultural icon, isn't he, Shaka?
Oh, absolutely is, yes. Very much so. And in fact, still a word that is spoken with great reverence and in many cases fear in Southern Africa, yes.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Zulu kings, I have read that there is some sort of coronation supposedly being planned in South Africa for the heir to King Goodwill.
So the Zulu secession story is a very complex and complicated one. And so they nominated a woman basically as a sort of standby after King Goodwill Cyprian Zwelithini died. She has stepped aside for, well, in fact, she's passed on for a young incumbent king who's more Swazi than he is Zulu. He can't even read Zulu properly, and a lot of people are commenting rather negatively on that. And Josh, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, because in history, typically Zulu kings generally don't die naturally. They are helped either with a weapon or poison. Mm-hmm. And until the Ingonyama Trust, which Zwelithini was the only trustee of, and it owns massive tracts of land in Natal worth billions, not millions, billions. Until that is sorted out, I rather cynically or nervously feel that this coronation is to do with a figurehead who most of the Zulus see as being expendable. And only time is going to tell whether my fear is correct.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. I believe it's delayed at the second due to various problems and disagreements.
I hope so. I hope so for his sake that I'm wrong.
Okay, yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Which you speaking about the king in waiting being more Swazi than Zulu, you are lucky enough as well to actually speak Zulu, I think is how
I do.
is
I speak Zulu. It's a great help in my job. It's a great help in terms of the areas that I visit. And I grew up playing with little Zulu kids on the farm where we lived. And my nursemaid was a Zulu. So I spoke Zulu alongside English growing up. And indeed, when I went to school, I was probably equally conversant in both. And then when I was doing my national service in this country, my army time, I served with Zulu troops because I speak Zulu. And these days I use Zulu quite often in the course of my work, and particularly the pronunciations that a lot of British people battle with. And the clicks are very difficult. You know, so many British people come out here and cannot believe that one can say kakagile and umugile and sikhayo gakangongobas of the Kungaba people and utu and kingkilimakwikwi. And these clicks are quite difficult, especially for the adult tongue, to become acquainted with. And so many of the pronunciations in Zulu, the average British tongue just fails dismally to try and reproduce.
Yeah, I think I would have some trouble as well trying to approximate them. I have tried on some occasions just for the fun of it, but I couldn't say that I would be any better at doing it than some of the people you've heard.
Well, we have a lot of fun with it, I must say. And the realization when people are listening, for example, in a lecture, and they realize when you say a word that that's how it should be said. They've read it, but couldn't work out how to pronounce it. It's wonderful to see that realization of, oh, that's how it should sound. And them then trying to reproduce it is often very amusing.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can absolutely imagine. And especially with some of the examples you gave just there, those Zulu is a beautiful sounding language. I think it's a great language, which I would learn if I had a cause to learn to learn it. But obviously, in Britain, there's not a great deal of need to learn how to pronounce some Sijo, for instance.
No, absolutely. And I mean, even around the world, it is very, very scarcely spoken, and there's hardly a need to learn to speak Zulu. But if one lives here in KwaZulu-Natal, being able to speak Zulu is a huge advantage, even if it's just to greet people in their language and to thank them in their language. Yeah.
I think that Zulu, correct me if I'm wrong, has one of the nicest ways to say hello to someone that I've ever heard, which is the sawubona, which is I see you. And that's just such
sawubona is very much I see you. And I love it because it's so similar to the Buddhist greeting of namaste, which is I see the good in you, or I see the God in you, or I see you as a human being. And sawubona, I see you, is a wonderful, wonderful greeting in Zulu. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's one of the nice surprises I came across when just accidentally one time when I found that out. I thought that was wonderful. So as we've seen, viewers who are still with us at the second, Rob is an excellent storyteller, and I highly encourage you to go and check out what he does and his videos there. But you're also not just interested in Zulu history and things, you're also interested in polar exploration, and you have some good stories about them as well. I say this with a lot of guests, but I do really mean it. I think I could talk to you and record things like for a very long time. This could be an endless video, because I would just be happy to sit and talk to you about history and stories and people, to be honest.